In reality, the person as a total, unlimited complex of labor power is hired and thus enters the relationship of dependence and subordination to another person as a complete person. However, as soon as the labor contract emerges as the purchase of labor, as a commodity, and this is the final result of the money economy, we are dealing with the offer of a completely objective work activity which, as has been stated, is introduced as a factor in the process of cooperation and is thus combined and coordinated with the work of the employer. The growing self-confidence of the modern worker is the result of the fact that he no longer feels subordinate as a person, but rather contributes only an exactly prescribed amount of work, prescribed on the basis of its monetary equivalent, which leaves the person as such all the more free, the more objective, impersonal, and technical work and its regulation become. The established money economy has similar consequences for the manager inasmuch as he now produces for the market, that is for totally unknown and indifferent consumers who deal with him only through the medium of money. His work is thus objectified in a way that is less concerned with and less dependent upon the individual person than was the case when local and personal considerations for particular buyers, especially where natural exchange relationships still prevailed, affected it. The development of personal freedom for domestic servants too is just as much the result of the increased importance of money. The personal bond that is reflected in domestic servants' unmeasured services is basically connected with their being members of the household. It seems unavoidable that, if the servant lives under the same roof with his master, is fed and sometimes clothed by him, his services will be quantitatively undetermined and dependent only upon the changing needs of the domestic situation, and that he has also to conform to the general rules of the household. Increasingly, the tendency seems to be towards transferring different services to people outside the household who have only to contribute quite specific services and who are paid solely in cash. The dissolution of the natural economic household community would therefore lead, on the one hand, to an objective fixing of service and to the more technical nature of services, and, as a direct consequence of this development, to the total independence and self-reliance of servants. If the development of working conditions continues to proceed in this direction, one made possible by money, then the elimination of certain abuses may perhaps be achieved, abuses for which the modern money economy has largely been blamed. The hostile rejection of relations of superordination and subordination is the motive for anarchism, and, although socialism replaces this formal motive by a more material one, it is nevertheless one of socialism's basic tenets to remove the differences in human conditions that entitle one person to command and force the other to obey. To a mode of thought that takes the degree of freedom to be the measure of everything socially necessary, the abolition of superordination and subordination is a self-evident demand. But a social order based on superordination and subordination would in itself be no worse than one based on a constitution of complete equality if sentiments of oppression, suffering and degradation were not connected with the former. If socialist theories possessed more psychological clarity with regard to themselves, then they would reflect an awareness of the fact that the equality of individuals is not at all the absolute ideal or the categorical imperative, but only the means for removing certain feelings of affliction for promoting certain feelings of well-being. The only exceptions are those abstract idealists to whom equality is a formal, absolute value demanded at the price of all kinds of possibly practical disadvantages, even at the price of per mundus. Wherever the significance of a demand does not lie in the demand itself but in its consequences, it is in principle always possible to replace it, since the same consequences may be attained by very different causes. Such a possibility is very important in this context since all experience has so far shown that superordination and subordination are quite indispensable means of organization, and their disappearance would destroy one of the most fruitful forms of social production. It is thus our task to preserve superordination and subordination as long as they have these positive consequences, while at the same time eliminating those psychological consequences that make such relationships abhorrent. This goal is clearly approached to the extent to which all superordination and subordination become merely technical forms of organization, the purely objective character of which no longer evokes any subjective reactions. The point is to separate the organization and the person in such a way that the objective requirements of the organization leave the individuality, freedom, and essential life experience of the person completely undisturbed, no matter what his position in the processes of production and circulation may be. One aspect of such a condition is already realized within a status order, that of the officer corps. Blind subordination to one's superiors is not experienced as degrading since it is nothing but a technically indispensable requirement for military purposes to which every superior is also subjected in the same strict and objective manner. Personal honor and dignity are completely separate from this super and subordination, which is only attached to the uniform and is merely an objective condition that has no reflection upon the person. Such differentiation also appears, in a different form, in connection with purely intellectual activities. There have always been persons who, despite the total subordination and dependence of their external positions in life, have preserved complete intellectual freedom and individual productivity, particularly in those periods when well-established social orders were traversed by the influx of new cultural interests. The old orders continued to exist while the new interests created altogether new internal hierarchies and categories, as in the age of humanism and in the last stages of the Ancien Regime. It is possible to conceive of a situation in which these casually evolving and one-sided conditions become the form of social organization as a whole. Super and subordination in all its possible forms is now the technical precondition for society accomplishing its goals. Yet it also reflects upon the intrinsic significance of the person, upon his freedom to develop, upon his personal relationship with other individuals. By dissolving this amalgamation, all upper and lower positions, all commanding and obeying would become a purely external technique of the social order, which could throw neither light nor shade upon an individual's position and development. Furthermore, all the resentment that is due to the too close association of the formalities and mere expediency of the social hierarchy with the personal subjective qualities of the individual, and which calls for an abolition of that hierarchy, would disappear. Through this objectification of performances and its organizational preconditions, one could preserve all the technical advantages of the latter and avoid the disadvantages for subjectivity and freedom which today are the source of anarchism and, to some extent, of socialism. This is the direction of culture for which, as we have seen, the money economy paved the way. The separation of the worker from his means of production, the ownership of which is considered the focal point of social misery, would in a completely different sense appear as a salvation. This would be true if such a separation were to mean the personal differentiation of the worker as a person from the purely objective conditions in which the techniques of production placed him. Thus, money would bring about one of those frequent developments in which the importance of one factor turns into its opposite as soon as it has unfolded a basic, consistent and all-pervasive effectiveness out of its original limited efficiency. Money, by driving a wedge between the person and the object, not only goes on to destroy the beneficial and supporting connections, but also paves the way for the independence of both from each other so that each of them may find its full satisfactory development undisturbed by the other.